Good morning, all. Thank you for attending. We are excited to be able to present to you this presentation on achieving the bulletproof shoulder through myofascial force transmission. This is a team made up of myself, Michael Gene Favor, Andrew Libbs, and Taylor Douthit. All speakers certify that we have no financial disclosures, no potential relationships that could reasonably be viewed or create a conflict of interest, and so on. Our learning objectives of today are to explain the physiological mechanisms and science of how mechanical force transmissions influence cellular differentiation, repair, and adaptation as it pertains to the shoulder complex. Applying current literature of myofascial force transmission to clinical practice to promote healing tissues, optimize clinical outcomes for the orthopedic shoulder conditions, implementing the appropriate magnitude, rate, frequency, duration, and the parameters around mechanical loading through interventions to promote positive tissue adaptation, and to develop rehabilitation training programs that deliberately target and enhance muscle, tendon, bone, and ligament load-bearing capacities of the shoulder complex in order to enhance the outcomes and the clinical practice that you have for your patients. So we have quite the agenda this morning. I'll take you through the roadmap. We'll start with an introduction defining what is mechanical transduction, mechanical therapy, introducing these concepts. We'll discuss the components and mechanisms of mechanical transduction as it applies to the anatomy, physiology, and shoulder-specific complex. Andrew Libbs will then take over. He'll talk about the clinical implications of force transmission. This includes the variables of force, movement determinants, and properties, as well as the functional rehabilitation continuum. Taylor Douthit will then speak to his clinical progression of how he addresses the acute shoulder all the way up through his return to sport and activity where he's enhancing the tissue capacities. We'll be interleaving the speakers, and Andrew Libbs will then be speaking to the injury risk reduction implications, speaking to training principles and heuristics, clinical principles and progressions. And then we'll also be presenting a clinical case that will talk about the now what and future directions, implications of rehab and performance. And then we'll finally conclude with some summary statements and then hopefully have about 10 minutes or so to discuss questions, answers, and have more of a dialogue. All right, to the introduction and defining mechanical transduction and mechanical therapy. So it was about 3 to 5 years into my clinical practice where I started to feel pretty comfortable with my competency as a physical therapist. And it was around this time that I started to ask myself some fundamental questions. And these started with, what is it that we actually do as therapists in clinical practice? You know, we do some joint mobility, we help people get stronger, we improve their movement patterns, help them with their endurance and their quality of life, give them loads of education that we're not reimbursed for all the time. We help them with their balance, their flexibility, a variety of things, all noteworthy. But I started to ask even further fundamental questions with the hopes that the answers would allow me to go to the next level and actually improve myself as a clinician and as a master of the craft. And so the next question was, what are the mechanisms by which we actually induce these changes? And it was around this same time that I had this conversation with a good friend who was previously a physical therapist and kind of a mentor and colleague of mine, who had actually transitioned more into orthopedic surgery. And some of the comments that we had within our conversations included, and one of the things that caused him to actually leave the profession was that he was feeling, as therapists, we simply, at our worst, if we're playing devil's advocate, are we simply distracting patients with exercise and palliative care, waiting for the natural history progression to run its course, where they are no longer out of the acute stages, their pain diminishes, and they're able to get on with the priorities of their lives and the functional demands that they otherwise have? And eventually, everyone is going to have a regression to the mean. It doesn't actually matter if you do this, that, or the other, and they're all close enough that people are going to eventually get better at, 5 years time point. And for me, that was really somewhat alarming and diminishing for what I felt like I could offer people as a clinician. And what is the physiological rationale for the interventions that we provide? Regarding the physiological adaptations, is there more to our interventions than just a system level outcome of strength, stretching, retraining, and balance, and what I had just spoken of what it is that we do? So in my attempt to answer these fundamental questions of what it is that we actually do and what are the mechanisms by which we induce physiological changes, at the very root and foundation was this concept of mechanical transduction, which is the process by which cells convert a variety of physiological mechanical loading into biomechanical responses that then lead to very specific tissue adaptations depending on the stimulus and the mechanical environment that they're provided. And for me, this was a big paradigm shift. And we look at mechanical transduction on almost like in a stepwise process. What we can see is that there's really 4 components in this linear pathway. So you have the mechanical stimulus, which is influenced by the tissue mechanical properties. This is also known as mechanical coupling, the physical stimuli imposed upon the cell that makes up a particular tissue. And then this is transduced into tissue force, influenced by the mechanical properties of that particular tissue as well as that particular cell and what forces that cell is otherwise sensitive to. And then you get the cellular force, and this leads to cytoskeletal rearrangement. And then this is also known as cell-to-cell communication, which is the resonance of stimulation from one cell to another within and across tissues. And then finally, you get the molecular response, which is the effector response, the intracellular responses that result in either adaptation or maladaptation based off the mechanical stimuli. And this then has a feed-forward mechanism into inducing changes within the extracellular matrix, synthesis and or degradation of said tissues. And so if you want to lump this into 3 simple steps, you have the mechanical trigger, the transmission of messages across tissues, not only within a particular tissue, and then the response at the cellular level to induce physiological adaptations and enhance the organism on the whole. And so this was really exciting because if we're, as physical therapists, in control of the mechanical triggers, well, then we can actually have very specific adaptations, and we can actually start to really better understand what it is that our interventions are having on the organism and on the patient physiology. And so based off a particular cell, there's these different mechanical stimuli that they're sensitive to, right? So you have tension and shear, vibration, compression, hydrostatic pressure, and even fluid shear. And so for me, this was really exciting. And so if you look at not only embryonic development and how we develop as organisms, but then more appropriate or applicable to our clinical practice, that we have these endogenous stem cells and tissue response cells or progenitor cells that, if induced with a mechanical stimuli externally applied, that they're sensitive to that, and that actually leads to epigenetic changes and the transcription of the certain DNA and thus protein synthesis, which then differentiates these progenitor cells and stem cells into everything from chondroblasts and osteoblasts, tenoblasts, irregular connective tissue that then form and help to regenerate into the tissues that we really focus a lot of our attention on in clinical practice: cartilage, bone, tendon, irregular, and connective tissue. And so we can actually help to not only promote healing, but even the performance and the complexity of the human system on the whole by being essentially the controllers of the mechanical stimulus or stimuli that we induce within our interventions. And though today's lecture is really focused on orthopedic and sports medicine in regards to the shoulder complex, and the examples that I give with the stem cells and the progenitor cells are kind of focused on more orthopedic specific tissues, mechanical transduction is a paradigm shift. And it's pervasive within the future of what we do as rehabilitation specialists, not only within rehabilitation specifically, but also when we're looking at CNS changes and pathologies and new therapeutic avenues, everything from headaches and glaucomas and Alzheimer's disease, spinal cord injury, cancers, and even traumatic CNS injuries. And so it's really the new paradigm of how we can actually enhance therapeutic regeneration of the human body on multiple system level. And moving not only beyond the musculoskeletal system, but even into beyond the animal kingdom and looking at not only organelles and that of plants. So compared to the relative hyperactivities of humans, plants do not appear to do much. However, they are actually constantly in motion as they develop response to the environmental stimulus, searching for light, nutrients, avoid predators, exploit neighbors, and reproduce. The time-lapse photography allows us to see the movements of plants and their sensitivity to mechanical transduction. Things such as what is known as nastic movements of plants that occur in response to environmental stimuli. And so you're looking at a video of what is known as morning glory vines as they express thigmotropic response or tropism induced by touch, and that shoots begin to curl around the supports in order to continue to grow and continue to prosper. And then when we look at important energy systems such as the mitochondria, and among diverse factors that contribute to human aging, the mitochondrial dysfunction has emerged as one of the key hallmarks of the aging process, linked to the development of numerous age-related pathologies, including osteoarthritis, metabolic syndrome, neurodegenerative disorders, cardiovascular disease, and cancers. And more emerging evidence reveals that mechanical transduction pathways are greatly impact the regulation and the health of mitochondria, their regeneration, and their homeostasis. And so this concept really is a paradigm shift of how we as humans really understand the biological worlds around us, not well beyond our patients, well beyond the musculoskeletal system, but is a fundamental principle that we can now leverage and allow for more specific adaptations, more specific interventions that help not only regeneration, but also move our patients from the healing process into performance. All right, within this section, I will present on the emerging science of the components and mechanisms of mechanobiology and how it relates to the shoulder complex, with the intent of providing a framework for the clinical application of regression that Taylor and Andrew will present thereafter. As we discuss anatomy and physiology, I think this quote is really pertinent. So I encourage each and every one of us to learn avidly, question repeatedly what we have learned, and analyze it carefully, and then put what we have learned into practice intelligently. Okay, some key perspectives that I want to share in regards to anatomy and mechanobiology. Given the setting of this presentation, I'm going to assume the vast majority, if not all, those in attendance are quite familiar with human anatomy. And thus, my intent is not to provide a review of human anatomy, but rather to share what is perhaps a different perspective and a more modern perspective from what has historically been. And the key perspectives that I want to present in regards to human anatomy and physiology and mechanobiology is the biotensegrity model of human biology, the laws of thermodynamics and self-organization, and the biological adaptations that our bodies undergo with specific mechanical stimuli. Starting off with the biotensegrity model. So if we look at the classic and the traditional perspective of human biology, it is popularly been described that human anatomy presents the skeletal muscles as structural independent actuators with distinct origins and insertions. Additionally, the classic lever mechanics has been applied to the movement and the structure of living organisms, commonly termed biomechanics. The traditional model also presents human biology and anatomy in what I consider a reductionist and contemporalized model of structure and function. And to this end, it really takes individual structures and speaks of them as separate entities rather than integrated, continuous means of biocontinuity, or what is also known as biotensegrity, which we'll get into in a moment. Anatomical textbooks generally organize things in a hierarchical system of large, important structures at the top, followed by smaller, less important ones at the bottom, or there below. Additionally, fascia, connective tissue, and intercellular matrices have been described as mere packing tissues and have been disregarded and or de-emphasized in functional contributions to what is human movement. And so I think that more contemporary science starts to challenge some of these foundational beliefs. So human biology is more accurately described through biotensegrity. And for those who aren't familiar, biotensegrity is defined as an architectural system that maintains itself through a separation of tension and compression and forms these different structures, which in themselves are known as closed-packed or efficiently closed-packed, meaning they're made of multiple parts in the smallest amount of space possible, where each part is structurally dependent on all those that otherwise surround it. And these components that make it up are composed of struts, which are rigid elements surrounded by stabilizing cables. And those are the otherwise elastic components. And you can see some of the properties of the tensegrity system shown there in the small video. And so the properties, when we look at tensegrity systems, are that they are super strong and they're energy conserving, as I mentioned. They're light in weight and resilient in effect of damaging forces. So you can see the structure here, how it is able to absorb the multi-directional forces that are otherwise applied to it. It's adaptable with minimal effort and returns to the same position. And so that bears the component of the elastic elements or cables. And then also it's self-stressing, meaning it has an element of internal stability through the balance of both compression and tension. And another basic principle of these tensegrity systems is that they're geodesic geometry, where these forces act upon it in straight lines, but give rise to complex curvatures at higher size scales. And the curvature is just another means of minimizing the energy of the system on the whole. So when you look at the mechanical properties of biological systems and you match up those same mechanical properties with that of classical levers and lever mechanics compared to that of tensegrity structures, we can get a sense as to which one is a better fit for mimicking that of biological systems. And so if you look at stress strain curves in biological systems, these are nonlinear. biological systems distribute their stress throughout, globally rather than locally. Their structural distribution is continuous. They're not, though we like to think of it in a reductionist standpoint where each anatomical structure is independent of those around it. Indeed, it's a continuous bioflow. They are gravity independent. And what I mean by that is the fact if you look at the cellular structure, the structure of such as like DNA or anatomical molecules, by smaller scale biological structures, is that these are inherently irrespective of gravity. They're able to sustain, they're self-sustaining in their structural capacity. These are, when we look at directional stability, they're omnidirectional, such as the shoulder. Their energy costs are low and their joints are flexible. As opposed to classical mechanics, where these are linear, local, discontinuous, gravity dependent, unidirectional, they're high energy costs, and they have rigid and fixed joint motions. As opposed to tensegrity model, which directly aligns with the mechanical properties of the biological systems, making this a otherwise better fit and a better mental model to better understand how biological systems respond to make mechanical loads and mechanical properties and have these unique mechanical properties. And so when you take that biotensegrity model and you look at human biology, you can see that there's multi-level repetitive scales of continuous tensegrity structures. Everything from the way the atoms form, and then down to the cellular structure, up to the intramuscular, the intermuscular connections, and then eventually the regional, where you get into the fascial slings. And we'll start to see how these tensegrity structures are pretensioned and dissipate force throughout to induce meaningful biological changes to the forces that are otherwise imposed upon it, i.e. in our case, our interventions. And a beautiful demonstration of this, perhaps many of you have seen the video of strolling under the skin, but I think it really, there's no other model that I've seen that actually helps us to really conceptualize and visualize the tensegrity model when it comes to muscle and fascial tissue and connective tissue, and how these force transmissions occur not only within a particular tissue, but across tissues to otherwise not only allow for the flow of force across biology, but also to allow for tissue adaptations in response to the mechanical forces that otherwise induced. And though you can see this as 2 separate or 3 separate muscle units, the same thing is occurring at a multi-scale level. So all the way down to the sarcomeres and the muscle fibers, is that there's this continuity of bioflow that causes not only longitudinal but also radial and stresses throughout the system, allowing for the transmission of force beyond what is typically considered to be the actuator. And so it really empowers us as clinicians to be able to conceptualize how powerful our interventions can otherwise be on structures that don't otherwise traditionally think of contracting. And so we can start to think of the human biology as being much more heterogeneous and much more granular than previously thought, where the reductionist model would separate these entities into muscle, tendinous, fibrocartilage, tide marks, and so on. In actuality, it's a continuous gradient. The continuous gradient, you can't even tell where the tendon begins, the unmineralized and the mineralized fibrocartilage begins. For it's an interdigitated blend between the two. The significance of this is that the force transmission, be it exogenous from outside of the body or endogenously induced by the muscle with a particular intervention, can actually have meaningful changes on the non-inert structures, or contractile structures, I should say. And so if we move up to the next level scale at the tissue level and considering intramuscular biotensegrity, we can see that our initial understanding of what is the supraspinatus or the infraspinatus is that these aren't single muscle units. Rather, there are hundreds of thousands, depending on the size of the muscle, of smaller muscles within the muscle. And that the all or none principle that we had come to know and love, as far as like, okay, this muscle or this exercise activates this said muscle. Yes, but it only activates certain portions of this muscle. And you can see that this is otherwise that the muscle fibers and the fascicles are encased in what we know traditionally as endomysium and paramysium and epimysium. And each of these layers of connective tissue are actually integrated within one another, not separate entities as we once thought. And you can see that the continuity here is shown in the illustration with integrins and connecting the muscle cells in the sarcoplasmic reticulum to that of the basement membrane. And then at the paramecial level, you can see that the paramecium is this honeycomb shape that houses the fascicles. And it's when these actin and myosin muscle fibers contract, almost 30% in some muscles, depending, up to 80% is distributed radially directly into the connective tissue. And that many of these fascicles do not run the entire length or gamut of the muscle, but rather end prematurely, so that there's even tendons within the muscle itself. And though we consider muscles to produce linear forces that transmit from the muscle fiber to the muscle tendinous junction, the tendon, and then into the capsule and the bone, and so on, in fact, there's a lot of these intramuscular stresses or force generations that actually occur. And so the schematic here shows a muscle at rest and then a muscle upon contraction. And you can see the small numbers there representing the different ways in which force can be distributed across the connective tissue or the non-contractile unit. So on number one, you get the radial forces, which in themselves are underrepresented. So when you actually look at radial force transmission, depending on the sarcomere length, is that it can produce upwards of 2.4 times as much as the actual axial or longitudinal forces. You also get at the same time, the directional insertion of the muscle fibers along the tensioning of the specific part of the fascia or the paramecium or the endomysium, depending on the layer that you're speaking of. And then we also get, without the muscle contribution, the fascia in itself can self-stiffen based off myofibroblast activity. And changes in water content can also influence the rigidity of these structures and the amount of forces that are coming from the muscle tendinous unit. And when we look within the cell, so you have the intercellular and the intracellular components. And the forces of attraction, again, are played out. So on a cellular level, you can start to see that myosin filaments and actin filaments create this structure of force adhesions, cytoskeleton mechanical transduction, and nuclear mechanical transduction. So if you have a soft ECM or a high ECM deformation, then you get this transmission of force across these actin and myosin filaments that, again, give the cell its tensegrity component. So it allows for the cell to sense activation, stretch, allowing for the activation of gate regulation channels and ion influxes into the cytoskeleton. These signaling pathways then find their way to a very similar structure that we see at the nuclear level. And then DNA in itself is just repeated helices of tensegrity structures. And it goes through the same process that you're well familiar with from your biological classes in your undergraduate degrees, where they talk about the transcription and how the animation shows that we go from these pre-tension structures, such as what we know as cells, and how they respond and adapt to the mechanical stimulus that is otherwise then applied upon them. And so I come back to the diagram that I started with, and I hope that I've been able to convey this concept of biotensegrity that occurs across multiple levels and multiple scales. And it's using the combination of struts and elastic compression to allow a pre-stress system to flow force across multiple scales, multiple levels, and across multiple different tissues, allowing for adaptation and for the biological system to actually have the mechanical properties that are more accurate than that which is described by the lever in the mechanical system. So what? So why does this matter, and what are the practical implications? So we know that mechanical forces influence growth, shape, and determine the behavior of nearly every cell, tissue, and organ of the human body. We know that externally and internally produced mechanical stimuli can be used to facilitate adaptation, i.e. accelerate healing, promote optimal mechanical properties, load-bearing capacity of tissues, and even enhance performance of both contractile and non-contractile tissues. We know that modern science of biological tissue mechanics is best explained via a biotensegrity model in which a multi-scale system of intracellular, extracellular, and intermuscular cross-linkages are subsequently transmit force through subsequent radial and linear means or pathways. And then we also spoke about this biotensegrity concept that is based on fundamental rules of physics, may represent a paradigm shift in the way that rehabilitation professionals think about the human body, part of the basic science that underpins our clinical reasoning. We also spoke about the human biological system is no longer need to be thought of as bones, muscle, and fascia as isolated structures or entities, but as contributors of a whole body-wide kinematic system that crosses multiple scales, everything from the nucleus to the cell to the tissue and so on, and that couples every part into a unified whole. And this has implications from the standpoint that local pathological alterations of mechanical tension or tissue properties are projected to neighboring and or remote regions, causing non-local symptoms, and or treatment interventions targeting both the local and the non-local site of the injury can promote adaptations, healing, enhance physical function and performance, leading to superior clinical outcomes. Okay, moving from the model of biotensegrity and looking at the anatomy, and now considering the actual mechanisms by which adaptation occurs. And we'll present this through the lens of the laws of thermodynamics and how biological structures adapt accordingly. So it was nearly 20 years to the month that Mueller and Maloff presented their seminal article of the physical stress theory. And you can see here in figure 1, which is associated with aging, injury, and immobilization of tissue, that the relative thresholds between injury and tolerance, which is hypertrophy, maintenance, and decreased tolerance or atrophy, actually don't change, but the absolute thresholds of these set points do. And this is in contrast to that of overload stress, where you get functional overreaching and the general adaptation principle, in which, once again, the relative thresholds between the different components or different layers don't actually change, but the absolute resiliency of the system actually is enhanced, improving the load-bearing capacity, the stiffness, and the overall robustness of the biological system or tissue at hand or in question. And this is associated with youth, rehabilitation, and training. Now, speed up 20 years, and what we have a much better understanding as to how these adaptations actually occur, and more importantly, how we can strategically and intentionally induce such elevation of thresholds to help with the rehabilitation, the regeneration, and the training of human tissue. So we go back to our key perspectives, and moving on from the biotensegrity model, which provides the framework and the pretensioned biology that allows for these other two mechanisms to actually play out. And so we'll talk about the laws of thermodynamics and self-organization, as well as how biological systems actually adapt. So we're not going to get into the details of all the physics nor the mathematics of the laws of thermodynamics, but we will briefly describe the laws of thermodynamics and how they directly relate to the transfer of energy, adaptation, rehabilitation, and building a robust biological system. In this case, the shoulder complex. Understanding a minimal amount of how these laws govern adaptation with respect to mechanical biology, I believe, can help us to better understand, help us to become better clinicians and to enhance patient outcomes through both primary and secondary prevention. So living organisms are constantly taking in, storing, and releasing energy to the environment as nutrients, heat, waste, forces, and information. And it is the continuous dispersion or dispersal of these resources towards some minimal energy state that automatically drives our power, that is the system, to adapt. So if we look at the 0th law of thermodynamics, a system is in equilibrium when there is no net change within the system or state over time, i.e. the human biology has a emphasized temporary healthy state in which the body maintains homeostasis. For the 1st law of thermodynamics, the total energy of an isolated system is constant. Energy can be transformed from one form to another, but cannot be created nor destroyed. And for us, that means that a living organism is able to extract energy from the environment and transform it into biological processes, but the energy input is equal to the energy output by means of heat dissipation, waste, forces, and other forms of physical information. And this drives us towards that minimal energy state that automatically drives and powers the system on the whole. So we are complex, dissipative systems far from what is known to be equilibrium. And then the 2nd law of thermodynamics is the state of entropy or disorder of the universe as a closed, isolated system that will always increase its entropy and disorder over time, and that changes the entropy. And that changes in entropy can never be negative. So over time, the system cells, tissues of an organism will increase in their state of entropy or disorder. And these are key foundational principles, that 2nd law in particular, that we are consistently fending off entropy. And that the universe on the whole does not like concentrated stresses. You can use the example of what is the Big Bang, and you can also use that in our context of what is tissue injury. When you get force concentrations within a particular tissue that surpass that tissue capacity or threshold, you get said little bang and or said tissue injury. And then the 4th law of thermodynamics, one of the characteristics of life is the ability to transform the architecture of the flow or the force flow in the ways that enable the currents to move more easily. So the 4th law of thermodynamics states that the dissipative component of energy is in the direction of steepest entropy ascent. In other words, energy will flow through a system in the most efficient means possible, the path of least resistance. Specifically, for a finite size flow system to persist in time, that is to live, it must evolve freely, such it provides greater access to its currents. And this is often considered to be the 4th law of thermodynamics. And it's fundamental to nature, not just biological systems. So the fourth law of thermodynamics has become to be known as the emergence or the constructionist law. As energy flows through a system, more efficient complex structures spontaneously arise. So notice the similarities between the two images that are shown. On the left, you have a vascular anastomosis of the cardiac system. On the right, you have an aerial view of the Columbia River Delta and the river basin on the coast of Oregon. Humans, and nature for that matter, are complex, dynamic, dissipative systems. One of the characteristics of life is the ability to transform the architecture of energy flow in ways that enable the currents to flow more easily. The multi-level scale model of biotensegrity is critical for the flow of force through a biological system. And thus, it's the biotensegrity that allows the framework or provides the framework for which adaptation, that is the emergence of complex systems or structures, to then occur. It is what we know as training and healing, and we'll go through some of the structure of the shoulders and of the shoulder and how they actually demonstrate this key principle of further complexity in organization through mechanical stimulus and through the flow of force. So if we summarize these laws of thermodynamics, and really the key takeaways here is the process of living is always accompanied by continuous development of imperfections characterized by entropy. And insufficient work performed by the system or applied to or internally produced by the system leads to entropy of the system increasing. The passage of time, unless dissipation of energy is continuously applied, leads to increased entropy. And as entropy within the system increases, the degree of randomness within that system also decreases, as well as the system's efficiency and ability to perform work and adapt. And so life is a constant battle to fend off entropy. And if we take this and apply it directly to more clinical application, is the fact that the more randomness that occurs within the system, the lower ability that system has to adapt, and the lower the ability of that system to otherwise dissipate oncoming forces that it encounters, i.e. increasing risk of injury, increasing risk of disease, and increasing what we know as mortality on the whole. And so if our primary goal and intent is to build a robust and bulletproof shoulder, well, then we need to understand which tissues around the shoulder adapt and to what mechanical stimulus do they adapt to. So let's take bone, for instance. So overhead throwing loads on the humeral diaphysis induce skeletal adaptations. This is well established. And what you're seeing here is the reconstructed CT imaging of bilateral humeri represented by major league and minor league baseball players in their throwing and non-throwing arms. And that there's a more robust diaphysis with visible broader diameter on the throwing side, substantially greater total of cortical bone area and cortical thickness, smaller medullary areas in the throwing arm as well. The throwing substantially increased the torsional strength indicated by the density weighted polar momentum of the inertia along the entire diaphysis, with strength nearly doubling towards the diaphysis, the distal diaphysis. When you look at the cross-sectional areas, and you can see the different percentiles shown here on the left-hand portion, which is just different cut points within the cross-section of the humeri, you can see that the peak tensile strain in the bilateral humeri demonstrate reduced strain in the throwing arm, meaning when you induce the same forces to the tissue, that it's much more resilient and robust. We're not otherwise surprised necessarily by this, but it emphasizes those principles that we spoke of. It emphasizes the underlying principle of biotensegrity and the flow of force through the system that then allows for a more complex and more robust structure to otherwise emerge. So what about beyond the bone? What if we consider cartilage? So the images shown here show the dramatic changes that can occur within chondrocytes and within the cartilage layers with immobilization and or loading. Now, I respect the limitations here that these are actually taken from the images specifically are taken from the medial tibial plateau of immobilized rabbits, but we know that there's consistent principles that determine adaptation and organization across biological structures and certainly within the animal kingdom. And similar studies exist for the knee and for the shoulder, but hold with me for the moment, right? So the average thickness of the glycosaminoglycans, as stained in red, is shown to significantly decrease after just 4 weeks. Up to there's a decrease in cartilage thickness up to 39%, and there's significant increases in chondrocyte apoptosis at 4 and 8 weeks after surgery in the articular cartilage. And so it just again, I understand that it's not specific to the shoulder in this case, but we know that the chondrocytes and the cartilage within the shoulder complex respond very similar to that of other synovial joints. So what implications can be drawn from that of rabbits and that of the knee to that of the shoulder? Well, so if we know that just with 4 weeks of immobilization, which occurs in nearly every one of the rotator cuff patients that I see, is how quickly can we induce stresses back onto this, right? So irrespective of tissue healing timelines, but what are the influence of that? And so the human shoulder joint is one of the most mobile joints in the body. And while in vivo shoulder kinematics under minimal loaded conditions have been studied, it is unclear how glenohumeral cartilage responds to high demand loaded exercises. So here's an example where they had the individuals do 30 push-ups, and they looked at the cartilage compressive strains on the glenohumeral articular cartilage, which can be measured with a validated MRI-based technique. And so the glenocartilage thickness maps, as shown with the thinnest part in blue and the thickest part in red, demonstrates that there's significant and immediate changes within the humeral head pre and post, demonstrating some thinning from the initial. So after the push-ups on the glenoid side, you have a decrease by 15%, and then a decrease by 17% on the humeral head, which, taken on face value, may be considered to be a concern. But in fact, what we know about human adaptation is that stress with rest equals growth. And so the conclusions here are that the push-ups can induce compressive strains on the glenohumeral joint articular cartilage, particularly on the anterior glenoid. The MRI-based method can be applied to further understanding of chondral changes within the shoulder under high-resolution loading conditions. And the clinical relevance is that these results can improve the understanding of healthy glenoid cartilage mechanics in response to loading of the upper extremity. And so we can consider that, yes, there's apoptosis within the cartilage following immobilization, but then we can see that within just a single application of closed kinetic chain exercise or repetitions, that we can make meaningful changes nearly throughout the glenohumeral interface. Okay, and if we ask the important question, is this critical structure of the muscle tendinous junction, the tendon and the EBCs, adaptable to change with mechanical force transmission and with progressive conditioning? And here we can see that the overwhelming answer is yes. So in the top image, you have the highly conditioned histological staining of a supraspinatus tendon in relatively young rats at 10 weeks of age. And then at the same at the same junction, you in the bottom right, you have the low condition rat shoulder. And we can see from the histological staining, which again, given the limitations between animal and human, is that there's a decrease in the cellularity and wavy orientation. There's a decrease in the number of elastic fibers and tight packing of the structure, which decreases the mechanical forces and the peak force to failure. And then we also see that there's an increase in size of the tenocyte nuclei relative to that of the highly conditioned shoulder. And this is consistent with tendon degeneration. And what is shown is that thus the low intrinsic fitness not only accelerates aging, but may also be an independent risk factor for developing tendon disease. Intrinsic fitness affects the rotator cuff tendons at least as much as aging, probably more, as demonstrated by the more regulated genes or the higher regulation of genes within the conditioned tendon. And thus, the low intrinsic fitness affects the rotator cuff, specifically the supraspinatus, more than aging, given this altered gene expression. So let's take an example. So the muscle tendon junction. So this gives, there's three groups here, three cohorts. So you have the sedentary group on the left. In the center, you have the calisthenic group. And then in the far side, you have the resistance training group. So the muscle tendinous junction we know is an area of highest force transmission. It's a susceptible location of injury and contributes to elevated risks of re-injury rates. Physical training appears as an alternative to strengthening the muscle tendinous junction and structure to ensure an effective transmission of force from skeletal muscle to tendon, which eventually ties into either the joint capsule and or the bone interface. And we saw the continuity of the tide mark previously. But the significant thing that I want to demonstrate with this example is when they look at the histological level of the invaginations that occur from one group to the next. We can see in the sedentary group that there's not nearly the same invaginations in the continuity between this between the muscle structure junction that is that of the calisthenic group, and even more so shown in the resistance training group. The tighter these junctions, the better they transmit force. The better they transmit force, not only does this allow for dissipation and tissue protection when external forces are applied, but it also allows for a more biologically sound system that can adapt to to mechanical forces and stimuli that are applied to it. And this is, I know that this is kind of somewhat a very specific example, but it's actually critical to demonstrate and to see what implications that this otherwise has on the human anatomy when strategic forces are repeatedly applied. The example that I would give here would be that if the same amount of external forces are applied in the sedentary group where you don't have the ongoing invagination and the cross bedding between the muscle and tendinous junction that is as robust as a trained group, then this tissue is more susceptible to not being able to transmit the forces and dissipate them, thus leading to the muscle tendon junction being a high probability of where the tissue would otherwise fail and injury would otherwise occur. So with the application of the shoulder exercise, this is deliberately what I'm trying to adapt initially, and I'll show you the candid examples of doing time under tension loading prior to your more traditional exercises in order to facilitate a better force transmission and a more robust interweaving of the different tissues. So you can see the quantified values here is that the sarcoplasmic invaginations increase by 32 to 36% in length, and there's an increase in 12 to 20% thickness in the muscle tendinous junction. And then in the resistance training group, there's over 200% thickening of the collagen and collagen fibrils and fibers under resistance training stimuli over the duration of at least 8 weeks. In this three-dimensional study of the muscular-tendinous architecture of the supraspinatus and its function correlates well to this concept. So what you're looking at is the supraspinatus and the different compartments there within, and it illustrates the heterogeneity within the muscle. So you have the anterior superior compartment, you have the anterior medial, you have the posterior region, you have the independent tendons within each of the anterior and the posterior regions. And this is taken from 10 male embalmed cadaver specimens, a mean age of 61 years. And you can notice that not only is there difference within the compartments, but then the pennation angles were found to be significantly different from one compartment to the next. And the clinical implications and significance of this is the functionality of these different compartments. So significantly larger volume of the anterior region suggests that much of the muscle force is produced by the anterior region tendon, may undergoing greater stresses and than that of the posterior tendon during contraction. This may lead to the higher incidences of anterior tendon tears, given that the pennation angles are significantly different between the different parts. Joint position has also been found to have a pronounced effect on the intratendinous strains within the rotator cuff mechanics. And so again, what we start to see is that what we thought of as just a simple muscle actually, again, has this integrated and heterogeneous aspect that causes force distributions to be much unique, have unique functions, and to be part of, again, a greater tensegrity model, even within a specific muscle belly. So when you look at the intramuscular connective tissue, specifically at the level of the paramecium, and you can compare and contrast healthy muscle that has readily been exposed to ongoing mechanical forces, mechanical tension, i.e. ongoing conditioning and interventions, and then compare and contrast that to that of which has been immobilized only for 3 weeks. You can see the significant difference that exists within the complexity of the tissue and the organization there within. And this only further reinforces that fourth law of thermodynamics and the importance of the ability of the connective tissue to be able to transmit force efficiently and effectively. And so if we take a closer look at the images here, we have, again, the healthy muscle tissue on the left, and we have the immobilized tissue there on the right. And we're looking again at the level of the paramecium in the intramuscular connective tissue. The healthy muscle fibers can be seen in 3 different orientations and can be clearly distinguished, separating in separate entities within the normal paramecium. And keep in mind that the paramecium runs in continuity with the endomecium and the epimecium. We call these separate things, but really there's continuity of flow between them. And then in the immobilized limb, you can see that there's a destruction with immobilization. And the different orientations of the collagen fibers cannot really be distinguished. And this is another prime example of how the biology within the shoulder complex adapts or fails to in the presence of force and ongoing conditioning versus not. And it's the second law of thermodynamics demonstrating the entropy of the system if ongoing work is not performed. And it also exemplifies the fourth law of thermodynamics, where ongoing force transmission and exposure to mechanical stimuli induces or promotes a more complex structure that can be able to dissipate exogenous forces, i.e. the forces that are coming into the system from external means. And then also it allows for a propagation of force, and thus a performance and a resiliency standpoint when the forces are generated from within. The analogy for me that I see is really, if you look at the healthy muscle tissue, it mimics the nice organization that you might see in a conifer. And then when you look at that of the immobilized, it's really more, it reminds me of the Dagobah system for those Star Wars fans out there, where there's a lot of disarray and the loss of the organization that prevents it from actually being able to propagate force and or dissipate it. So what is the takeaway? What are the big key points that I want to convey here? And what does it mean for clinical practice? So the human biology system is an ever-evolving, dynamic, complex, dissipative system that is governed by the law of thermodynamics. As rehab professionals, we prescribe interventions that seek not only to fend off entropy, but to restore organization to our patients following injury and or disease, which is the second law of thermodynamics. Through intentional application of mechanical stimuli, we as rehab professionals can induce specific tissue adaptations, i.e. increase the complexity of the biological architecture, and thus enhance the dissipation of force through the system, which in turn increases the resiliency of the local, regional, and global system on the whole, and then also allows for greater entropy production there within. Moreover, we've seen that every cell type of the shoulder is responsive to mechanical stimuli. A variety of mechanical forces can be implemented to facilitate the healing of injury and or surgical repairs of the shoulder complex. And through mechanobiology mechanisms, rehab professionals can influence the epigenetic behavior of the shoulder complex, which we know consistently, even more so than just collagen deposition, really reestablishes the mechanical properties of these tissues. And by so doing, we can enhance performance, provide a more robust means of secondary injury prevention. We can also play a vital role in the future of regenerative medicine and offer novel future research avenues. And I'm excited for this, for our next speaker, for Andrew and Taylor, to take this forward and actually translate this information and this science and this perspective into clinical practice that will help to enhance, hopefully your development as a professional beyond the shoulder complex, but more importantly, improve the lives of the patients that you see and treat. Thus far, we've talked about the science of mechanical transduction. We've talked about the biotensegrity model. We've talked about how the flow of forces through the laws of physics can actually influence not only epigenetics, but also allow for the ongoing increased complexity of structures and the integration of the bioflow from one tissue to the next to allow for enhanced, more robust shoulder complex, given the continuity of flow of forces when exogenously or endogenously applied. But what does that mean for real-world clinical practice? I think by understanding mechanical transduction, the mechanisms at which our interventions actually induce changes is not just theoretical and nice to know. I think it's absolutely critical that we are thinking about these concepts on a daily basis with every intervention that we provide. And by treating the human body as a biotensegrity structure and leveraging the laws that govern its adaptations, I do believe that our profession can enhance the value that we offer to society, significantly improve the specificity of the care that we provide, and live up to our mission to improve and optimize the care that we give to each and every patient. And I'm really excited for this next transition where Andrew and Taylor will take you through how they actually apply these principles, how they transform clinical practice through applying the science of mechanical transduction and bridge this gap between what is the benchtop science into what is real world meaningful changes for your clinical practice and our profession on the whole. Okay, so wrapping it all together, let's take a look back at some of the key seminal points that we want you to walk away from today's presentation with. The summary, the conclusions, and future directions. So we started off by defining what is mechanical transduction and the process by which cells convert a variety of physiological mechanical loading into biomechanical processes, adaptation, and epigenetic changes on the cellular level, which then induces changes on the tissue level and then on the organism and the system on the whole. We had kind of buttresses into three big categories of the mechanical trigger, the transmission of messages across the tissue, and the response at the cellular level to induce these adaptations. We spoke about the practical implications as every cell in the shoulder is responsive to mechanical stimuli, and a variety of mechanical forces can be implemented to facilitate the healing and or surgical repairs of the shoulder complex. And through mechanical biology mechanisms, rehabilitation professionals can influence epigenetic behavior of the shoulder complex, which has profound implications for enhancing physical performance, providing a robust means of secondary prevention, and playing a vital role in the future of regenerative medicine. Not only this, but it opens this idea and this concept of biotensegrity and the science of mechanical biology, allows and offers novel avenues for future direction and future research. Though having the ability to restore the mechanical stability of someone's shoulder through robotic and artificial intelligent assisted surgery is incredible. Offering interventions, be it manual therapy, exercise, education, that directly influences a patient's DNA expression and replication, and induces specific architectural adaptations that fend off entropy, injury, and disease, and simultaneously positively influence the patient's self-efficacy as they overcome the physical, emotional, and psychological challenges that accompany injury is remarkable in its own right. Give me a scalpel or give me mechanical forces, I will certainly take the latter. We then heard from Andrew Libbs, who helped us translate what was the science of mechanical biology and mechanical transduction into mechanotherapy, which is the deliberate application of these mechanical forces to stimulate and promote positive tissue repair and remodeling via mechanical transduction. He taught us the importance of the power of specificity, meaning taking just not force in and of itself, but being really deliberate about the intensity, the magnitude, the rate, the duration of this to help to influence and bias specific tissue adaptations and specific tissues in order to induce a more robust patient and a more robust outcome. Random training begets random results. Having a more granular understanding of the biological and cellular mechanisms of mechanical therapy allows us to be more specific with our interventions. Taylor then took us through a criterion-based therapeutic intervention progression that he uses that follow along the hybrid model, not just time-based healing and biological healing, but that of having specific criteria in combination and accompanied with the concepts of mechanical biology. And then we heard from Andrew in his clinical application and clinical case examples with the several videos that he showed of how we can transform clinical practice through the translation of the science that is mechanobiology, physics, cellular responses to mechanical stimuli, the pre-tensioning of the biointegrity model, and hopefully that this not only sparks interest, ideas, and novelty for you and for our profession on the whole moving forward of how we can take these concepts and making meaningful changes within people's lives and enhancing people's outcomes. I recognize that a considerable amount of the information around the science of mechanical transduction and the architectural changes were specific to the shoulder complex. Yet, as is demonstrated by the criterion-based progression that Taylor provided, as well as the case studies that Andrew provided, that these forces of biotensegrity, mechanical transduction, the flow of force, force dissipation need to be applied to the entire system on the whole. All too often is the shoulder a victim rather than the culprit when there are energy leaks elsewhere within the kinetic chain. In such cases, the shoulder is all too often used to compensate and overcome the diminished summation of forces in order to achieve the same relative output, such as throwing a punch, throwing in your overhead throwing athlete, or in the example provided with the javelin, where you can see a wonderful flow of force from the ground up through the hips, through the torso, and then ballistically through the upper extremity. And you can see the graph there on the right demonstrating that indeed the shoulder is really just a structure in which force flows through. As it is propagated through the kinetic chain, it only accounts for 21% of the total output. The importance of the shoulder within the kinetic chain is critical when we're talking about the summation of forces. In the presence of an energy leak elsewhere within the system, it's likely going to be one of the structures in particular where you're going to get an overcompensation. The shoulder is really just a catapult through which the forces flow through and allow for the ballistic release of the momentum and the energy that is otherwise driven elsewhere. So if we end like we began and we ask ourselves, what is it that we actually do as physical therapists? And I hope that when you ask the question or the common question of how can I get this patient better, what are the movement system impairments that I need to address? Rather, I hope that what we've provided today is a shift in the profession's mental model. When it comes to our approach to promoting healing and restoring tissue capacity and performance. For decades, the APTA, the pioneers within our field, and our contemporary DPT curriculum have advocated for the adoption and the claiming the human movement system. We are clinically oriented to the movement impairments and the interventions that are necessary to correct them. This system level inclination and perspective predispose us to overlooking the cellular and the molecular biology that influences our movement-related interventions. Supplementing our knowledge of the movement system with how clinical, well, with how and I believe if we ask more specific questions, then we get more specific answers. And we can be, and as such, we're better at what we do. These specific questions will range depending on the phase of rehab that we're in, such as what is the pain generator, specifically down to the tissue level? What is the insult to the tissue? What mechanical stimuli are needed in order to be able to not only calm the inflammatory process, but also start to facilitate and accelerate the healing faster than what would be the natural history progression otherwise would be? What stimuli could be provided to reduce or facilitate the healing and or repair process? In the subacute phase, we move out of that pain generation state and more into our resiliency. How can we bring resiliency back to the tissue? What mechanical stimuli can and optimally be applied? What adjacent or regional tissues or structures influence the injured region, and how can we start to adapt those in order to help to synchronize the system as we get closer and closer to the prior level of function and closer to that return to function phase? What interventions will assist with the reintegrating this body region to the tissue in the kinetic chain? So taking principles from what Andrew presented with the link, sync, connect phenomenon and reintegrating the body region. What additional loading strategies, rate, intensity, volume, duration, direction of forces are necessary on the tissue, regional, and system level to ensure a resilient outcome? And then also not only resiliency, but the ability to then perform. Keep in mind that a lot of today is speaking towards the mechanical components. This is not to negate the biopsychosocial elements, nor is it to negate the effectiveness and the efficiency of the assumption that we make for the biological system in front of us to be able to adapt. So in the same thought that I began with, is that I encourage you to continue to learn avidly, question repeatedly what you have learned, analyze it carefully, and then put what you have learned into practice intelligently. I see mechanical biology and myofascial force transmission as a new era in medicine, ripe for innovation, interventions with enormous potential to overcome many illnesses, injuries, and diseases. And I also see significant opportunities in science, regenerative medicine, and clinical practice that lay before us. It's just a matter of whether we're going to take the opportunity or let it pass us by. A special thank you to the attendees, the American Physical Therapy Association, the Academy of Orthopedic Physical Therapy, the event volunteers that make this all possible, and the combined section meeting sponsors. Thank you all for your time and your attention. I look forward to our discussion and question session.
Probably the lady in the email made it seem like we should print our content if we wanted
Not necessary.